Reflection 4 has the prompt is basically that you choose 5 documents and explain the clashes and conflicts of the later 20th century. And it begins with chapter 27, which is the 60s, and goes all the way up through the modern period. So I thought what I would do is kind of break this down a little bit by chapter, and kind of run over what I see as some of the major conflicts and clashes. And really, you're picking 5 documents. You can pick them from across the chapters, or you can pick them from within the chapter. I think what you'll notice is that there's several themes that kind of pop up here within these. So let's start with chapter 27. Chapter 27 is the 60s. And kind of talks about the not so much, talks about the tensions that we see happening in the 60s. So you don't see a whole lot of reference to John F. Kennedy. So he's pretty early in the 60s. He's really kind of that transition period. So this is going to focus pretty much on what's happening, as far as LBJ, as far as the civil rights movement, as far as other groups and that sort of thing. So let me kind of point out the images here. You've got a picture from the Selma March, and of course, major conflict, the issue of voting, the issue of civil rights. This picture of LBJ working with civil rights leaders, how to get that accomplished. So you have LBJ and civil rights leaders working against the opposition forces. Your George Wallace's, your Lester Maddox's, that are refusing to allow progress to take place. The Southern Democrats that are kind of upset over civil rights. And so one of the major conflicts and clashes are between those groups. You also have another conflict and clash with women. Women coming into the 1960s begin to have kind of an awakening, kind of a rejection of that 1950s very strict gender roles conformity. And it's across age levels. It's not just the young baby boomer women. It's also older women as well. It does tend to be a little bit heavily at first among white women, but eventually it incorporates all women. And you certainly see with the Black Power movement, African American women are important leaders in that movement. And so this is a part of women becoming aware of their particular role in the 1960s. So let's kind of talk about this. The documents kind of go in chronological order. So we'll pick up with Barry Goldwater's Republican nomination speech. This is a fascinating read, and I'd like to point this out because one of the conflicts and clashes that we see developing in the second part of the 20th century is a clash between kind of what we would term as liberalism, of focus on equality and opportunity, with the idea of kind of conservatism, that we don't want too much government involved, that we want to keep, that we want to focus on just basic ideas, basic values. Kind of in some ways, it's a conflict that we saw back with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. One believes in a stronger government working for the good of everyone. The other believes that big government is the enemy of the people, and that people are best when they are allowed to govern in kind of small local areas. And so Barry Goldwater is getting the Republican nomination in 1964. And he gives this speech that kind of is talking about, his vision for America. And basically that he makes this reference here, that we should not be stagnant in the swampland of collectivism, not to cringe before the bully of communism. And he says, the tide has been running against freedom. Our people have followed false prophets. That what we want is a freedom that is protected because our government is limited, that we have the laws of nature and God's freedom, and that we will not be kind of forced to do things because this is what the mob says, right? So in some ways, this would be very similar to kind of the not PC, right? We don't have to follow political correctness. We just, whatever, God intends for us to be free, and I have these freedoms and all this kind of stuff. And he talks about us being for freedom. And he goes that basically that this administration, which we shall replace, has distorted and lost that faith. It has talked and talked and talked the words of freedom. We have the wall of shame in Berlin, the sands of shame at the Bay of Pigs, the slow death of freedom in Laos, failures in the jungles of Vietnam, failures that haunt the houses of once great alliances and undermine the greatest bulwark ever erected by free nations, the NATO community. Failures proclaim lost leadership, obscure purpose, weakening wills, the risk of inciting our sworn enemies to new aggression and new excesses. Because of this administration, we are tonight a world divided. We are a nation becalmed. We have lost, this individual creativity. We are plotting at a pace set by centralized planning, red tape, rules without responsibility, and regimentation without recourse, right? That this bureaucratic state has taken over, and he points to the violence in our streets, corruption in our offices, aimlessness among our youth, anxiety among our elders, despair among many who look beyond material success for the inner meaning of their lives. Where examples of morality should be set, the opposite is seen. Small men seeking great wealth or power have too often and too long turned even the highest levels of public service into mere personal opportunity. And so he goes on to talk about wanting to make America better, right? Pointing to LBJ, pointing to John F. Kennedy, and basically claiming that they have damaged the country with their expansive government authority. And of course, part of this has to do with civil rights. Remember, this is, following, and this is in 64, as they're getting ready to pass the Civil Rights Act. And so he's talking about, people preserving this notion of freedom. Freedom is kind of this all-encompassing value, if you will, and that government is dangerous to that freedom. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. So very clearly a different perspective. So if you think about kind of this idea between the agents of change, the civil rights movement, LBJ, and then the people that don't want things to change. You could definitely put Goldwater in that camp of people that don't want things to change. And really kind of being critical of this new world that he finds himself in. This is Lyndon B. Johnson talking about the American Promise in 1965. Talking about the need for the Voting Rights Act, and that we have to, the issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue, being an issue that that we have to deal with kind of things on the level of war and peace and prosperity and depression. We should defeat every enemy. We should double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue when we have failed as a people and a nation. That basically all men are created equal, that government by the consent of the governed, give me liberty or give me death. That these are the values for which America has fought. These are the promise to every citizen to share in the dignity of man. It's not found in possessions, that we need to open up voting to everybody in this land, right? That any local government that refuses to do that, right? And he makes this reference to Selma, and that we shall overcome the legacy of bigotry and injustice. Gives a little bit of his own personal story about he had seen what poverty and discrimination and racism could do, but that he's going to do what he can to change this particular system. So you contrast LBJ's speech about the Voting Rights Act with Barry Goldwater's speech. And, Barry Goldwater's clearly blaming the federal government for hurting freedom. And yet in reality, what we see is that we know that voting rights are being suppressed by state and local governments. And so Barry Goldwater's suggestion is that we should trust the state and local governments to guide us, not the federal government. But yet the federal government is the one that's actually protecting freedom for African Americans. So it presents an interesting contrast and conflict there between these versions about big government versus small government. What is the position of the federal government? What kind of role should the federal government take? And it just makes things much more complicated, right? And then you've got his Howard University commencement address talking about opportunity and how opportunity needs needs to be expanded. So this is very much a great society kind of speech. Where he's essentially saying, freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away scars of centuries by saying now you are free to go where you want, to do as you desire, choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing him up to the starting line of a race, and then say you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. It's not just enough to open the gates of opportunities. All of our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. So the idea of access to fulfill the fair expectations of man, right? That this is what we have to do, right? So that we have to take the prosperity that our country has and share it with more people, right? So kind of this idea, so you go from, Barry Goldwater complaining about the role of this big federal government to LBJ talking about the power of the vote and the federal government protecting and expanding voting rights. Now you have the federal government talking about helping people fulfill their goals and expectations, creating an equal opportunity to access, right? So that's absolutely kind of part of that conflict that we see happening. Now, this one's a little bit different. This is the National Organization for Women's Statement of Purpose. NOW was founded in 1966, and they are talking about that women should have a fully equal partnership of the sexes, a worldwide revolution of human rights, that women should be in the mainstream of American society, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. We believe the time has come to move beyond the abstract argument, discussion, and symposia over the status and special nature of women, which has raged in America in the recent years. The time has come to confront with concrete action the conditions that now prevent women from enjoying the equality and freedom of which is their right as individuals and individual Americans and as human beings. That women should be able to, to join in politics and in economics, that they organize to initiate or support those actions, strengthen, the American society, help women gain access to jobs, education, professions, that discrimination should be, in employment, should be, the prohibitions against that should be enforced. They go on to say there is no civil rights movement to speak for women as there has been for Negroes and other victims of discrimination. The National Organization for Women must therefore begin to speak, right? So women were not the ones women were not being represented as a whole, right? That the law, that the Constitution must be applied to women to protect their rights, right? And that women's problems are linked to broader questions of social justice, right? And women will have to work together with other groups, right? And so the really kind of calling into question, first off, this expansion of the notion of civil rights to go beyond African Americans to include women, recognizing that there's lots of other subgroups in this process, and calling out some of the issues about lack of opportunity. If you think back to the Declaration of Sentiments and some of the ways in which they pointed out that women didn't have access to jobs and opportunity, now is saying the exact same thing. And that women, should be able to, that they're going to challenge the depiction of women in media, that they're going to, stop contempt for women, and that women should create a new image for themselves. So you have this kind of elevation of women into, as a piece of society, as an equal partner. And now is going to be that group that speaks for them. And so you have kind of an interesting development there. So this is kind of apart from the issue about government and the role of government in our lives, and is, the government expanding civil rights and intrusion, or is it what's required, right? And now you have the National Organization for Women really laying claim to some of the same levels of action that the SCLC and the NAACP and CORE and SNCC have been talking about. And so they're, really kind of going to press for this particular change. So one of the conflicts that you see bubbling up in the 60s is going to be the conflict of rights, of gender, of economic opportunity, right? You could certainly see the issue of economic opportunity in the LBJ's Howard Address, right? So some interesting ways you could kind of look at it there. This one is, I actually found this a little bit awkward to read because I think it's harder to read. It would be good to watch a video clip of it if I could find one. So basically, this is an account from 2012 where George Garcia was interviewed about being a corporal in the U.S. Marine Corps, and he kind of talks about his time in Vietnam and his experience coming home from the war. And it's a pretty kind of hard story. It's kind of a hard account to read, both in the nature of him talking about the friendly fire that affects his group, what he saw, how it affected him. And I think, in a nutshell, what it's telling you is the impact of Vietnam, that one of the major clashes and conflicts is going to be the issue of Vietnam and how that works, how that kind of has this impact in American society. So that kind of takes you through chapter 27. I'm going to record chapter 28 separately, but you'll see some common themes that kind of stretch across, whether you're talking about Vietnam, whether you're talking about women, whether you're talking about the role of government.